Good morning, everyone, and great to be here with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the ADB for the invitation that they have extended to the ILO, and I'm very privileged to have been the one to take up this privilege and be here with you. I'm going to focus on the evolving global and regional priorities on social protection and providing a perspective from the ILO, as the subtitle says. So without further ado, let me move to the content of my presentation. I was told to point in the direction of, voila, I hope that's working. So I'd like to begin. I know that we've already been discussing the kind of extension of social protection, how much of it is really being realized as a right by the global population, particularly with a focus on the region. Here, I really want to take us and to say that despite the huge progress that has been made and the huge efforts, and in particular, we saw quite a mobilization during the 2 or 3 years of the pandemic. However, still, the state of social protection is what it is, with only about 46.9% of the global population being covered by having at least one social protection benefit. What this means is that more than 4 billion people have no kind of benefit to fall back on when they need it. Now, this is a global average, and if we drill down, and you will see in the little circles below, we have some regional averages, and they range from around a little under 84% in Europe and Central Asia to as little as a bit over 17% in Africa. And you will, of course, see that Asia and Pacific is there with around 44%, just below the global average. So our job is not done. We also know that if you look at the different branches of social protection, which are provided in the circle to the right of your screen, there are some particular branches in which coverage rates are particularly low. And this applies in particular to unemployment protection, where only 1 in 5 unemployed persons has access to unemployment benefits. Also sickness benefits, around 33%. Disability benefits, only about 33.8% of people with disabilities have access to the needed benefits. And of course, this does not say anything about the adequacy of those benefits for even something like pensions, which has one of the highest coverage rates. We will get to that a little later. And of course, the challenge of closing these protection gaps, as we know, is getting particularly overwhelming and difficult in the context of compounded crises that we're in, and some of the structural impediments that exist, including persistent poverty and widening inequality, which is also linked to a stagnating labor share of income, and I will come to that point later. We also have very high rates of informality, almost 2 billion informal economy workers, and we know that the majority of them lack access to social protection. And of course, what we have been discussing throughout the 2 days is the climate crisis, which is arguably the mega trend that is framing and compounding all the other challenges that countries are facing. And last but not least, there are also the demographic changes that are happening. I know population aging is a particular challenge in this region, but also in many, many others. So let's move on, however, to just recap on some of what social protection can do, particularly if it is provided to a significant share of the population, if the benefits are adequate, and if we have comprehensive and sustainable systems. And here, I just want to quickly touch on the issue of poverty, which of course is a major concern, a major goal of our Sustainable Development Goals, and something that all countries are trying to address. And here, the main message is that what we know is that social protection produces multiple benefits for the society and for economy, but what is also very clear is that social protection expenditure is associated with lower poverty rates. And what you see here are figures, I should recap are figures for the European countries taken from Eurostat, where what we see is that this is the most recent data for European countries, which shows that the risk of poverty, income poverty, is reduced in the total population after taxes and social protection benefits by over 1/2, from around 43.6% to 16.5%. So a major impact on poverty. If we're interested in poverty, we should be interested in building those social protection systems. But we also know that the challenges of inequality are also quite significant in many regions of the world, and a challenge that has been growing, even in some of the countries that are showing very significant and respectable rates of growth. This is accompanied sometimes with very high rates of inequality that, as we know, even the IMF and the World Bank have been quite clear that there are challenges with growing inequalities, not only in being able to reduce poverty, using growth rates to reduce poverty, but also in the way in which it really challenges social and economic sustainability. And that's something we should be, and political sustainability, by creating social tensions and really a sense that societies are not fair. And that does translate sometimes into social discontent that can be quite challenging in many contexts. And here what we see is that if you look at the figure comparing levels of inequality in market income, which is captured by the Gini coefficient, combining the green and the blue bars, and then what you have in the green bars is the level of inequality after taxes and transfers. And here what we see is that there's a significant sort of difference across countries in their capacity to reduce inequalities through their tax and transfer systems. Many European countries here, which are clustered to the left, are those that reduce inequality by more than 1/3 after taxes and transfers. Many of the middle-income countries where social protection systems are not as well developed, as comprehensive and adequate, do so to a lesser extent. So I think the key message here is that building social protection systems that are comprehensive, adequate, and universal can also be very effective in reducing those inequalities. And just to also point to now, okay. Sorry, this is flipping without me touching the buttons, okay. But also what I wanted to emphasize is that those inequalities that can be reduced by social protection are not only the income inequalities or vertical inequalities, as they're often referred to, but also social gender inequalities, for example. And here we have a figure that shows the level of women's earnings as a percentage of men's earnings, both disposable income and market income. And as what we can see is that in some of the countries at least, after social benefits, women's income as a percentage of men's income tends to increase. For example, here we see in Uruguay, just to take one example, from about 56% to 64% of men's income. It does not close the gender income gap, but it helps in reducing that gap. So I think that's the key message. And the point to really emphasize with all of these impacts on poverty and inequality is that social protection is really the oil that enables the flywheels of economic growth and development to begin rotating. Now, historically, we know that social protection investment has really been a precondition for economic dynamism. And this is kind of quite clear, the economic history of, for example, many Nordic countries that even after the Second World War emerged with relatively devastated economies, civil wars in Finland, and building that social protection system was really an effective means of enabling economic dynamism to become the countries that they have become, economically dynamic and socially quite inclusive. In other words, countries don't invest in social protection after they develop. They invest in social protection in order to develop. And this is a really important message. There's not a trade-off between investing in social protection and having economic dynamism and development. And I think for many developing countries that are striking to catch up and to really have that engine of economic development, this is a key message to take in mind. Now, the key question is, how do we do this? And this is what I think we've been discussing over the past 2 days. And what I really want to highlight here is that what we said in our World Social Protection Report is that countries really need to take the high road towards universal social protection. And how to do this? Well, there's a lot of guidance that is provided through international social security standards. I'm talking here about the not only human rights standards, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that recognizes social security as a right, as well as the international labor standards, international social security standards. We have conventions, for example, Convention 102. We have recommendation, like Recommendation 202, that together really provide what I would call the guiding principles in terms of how to build those universal social protection systems. These are not straitjackets. They're not one-size-fits-all formulas. They are broad principles that can be really helpful in building social protection systems. Principles like universality and accessibility for all, which means that social protection is not limited to workers who are in a dependent employment relationship. It also should apply to those who are self-employed, for example. Big challenge in many parts of the world, how to extend those systems to those who are self-employed, to those who are working in the informal economy. Issues around adequacy of benefits, also very key in our standards, to ensure a decent standard of living, and not benefits that don't even pull people above a sort of minimum poverty line. Of being comprehensive and covering all of the risks in the life cycle and not just patchy and incomplete. Issues also around, very importantly, predictability. And this really means that benefits must be anchored in legislation. They have to have legal anchoring, so they don't become a sort of used for political, electoral purposes. They come in with one administration and disappear with the other. We need that legal anchoring to give people also the predictability and reliability of those benefits. They must be participatory in their design, and also, very importantly, and I want to get to that point, around sustainability of financing, but also fairness and equitable financing, so the burden does not fall on those with the least capacity to contribute to the financing. And I'll have more to say about the financing issue. For the rest of the time that I have, I want to sort of concentrate on integrated policies and integrated financing. I think these two issues have already come up, but I just want to pick them up and later also relate them at the end of my presentation to a big and a relatively major initiative that is called the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions that the UN Secretary General has launched. And as I will explain, this has within it this effort to bring together integrated policies, social protection, employment, labor market policies, fiscal policies, together with integrated financing. The two need to go hand in hand. Policies without that financing, we know, stay trapped on paper and never make an impact. So, with that, I think I'm going to quickly run through a few points about the need for integrated policies. We know that this, in the UN jargon, we talk about policy coherence. We need to have social protection policies that are coherent and are working in tandem with industrial policies, labor market policies, employment policies, with care policies, skills, and so forth. For example, on labor market formalization, we need policies that prevent the misclassification of employment relationships, that don't falsely call people, self-employed when they're really in a dependent relationship within their employment relationships. We need systems that simplify the making of contributions and taxes, particularly for those micro and small enterprises and people who are self-employed. We need to have incentives there that can really bring forward affiliation of people into these benefit packages, and temporary subsidies for those who have limited contributory capacity. We also need to have this facilitation of coverage of people who are in temporary, part-time employment, and, as I said, for the self-employed. This is a big issue, a big challenge. Workers on platforms, we know, have much lower rates of access to social protection than other workers, whether they're platforms working in situ or online. They compare quite unfavorably to other workers. We need that kind of coherence with active labor market policies that we talked about already yesterday, with lifelong learning, skills development, so that people are equipped for the dynamism and the changes in sectors where employment is available. Big issue in the context of climate change and the structural transformations that countries need to make to really shift from brown to green economies. We cannot afford not to have people make that shift and be left behind. And of course, very important coherence with care policies, with parental leave, childcare, and long-term care. So this policy coherence is a big theme, and yesterday we had many great examples. I don't want to dwell on them, but maybe highlight some of the key points here to say that these integrated policies, it's not a pipe dream, it's not an abstract kind of idea. It's actually being done in practice in many of the countries, and you know about many of them, but maybe let me highlight a few that maybe are not so familiar, particularly with people who work in this region, coming from Latin America. Here we have had in several countries what is called a monotax, which simplifies and unifies payment mechanisms for micro, small, and medium enterprises. And this has been shown to be very effective in formalizing those enterprises and also extending social protection to their workforce. It has worked in countries, and we know several of them, in countries like Uruguay, in Brazil, in Argentina, Ecuador, and so forth. And Uruguay is interesting because they have used this concept and this mechanism now more recently for extending coverage to platform workers, quite effective in doing so. And one of the innovative features in Uruguay was the involvement of private actors like Uber and others to use these IT platforms and the advanced technologies that they have to really prevent the evasion of taxes and contributions and to simplify it, particularly for workers on platforms. So quite an interesting example there. We also have many other examples of countries that you're more familiar with, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that, and I want to really say a bit more about the whole issue of financing. Because as I said, you know, the best of policies, the best of integrated designs for policies, social protection, working hand in hand with employment, with active labor market policies and so forth, it won't happen if that financing is not there to translate it into real kind of change and implementation on the ground. And here we get a glimpse of the fact that you all know there is underinvestment in social protection. Coverage and adequacy gaps, we know, can be explained to a large extent due to this underinvestment. Underinvestment in the institutions that are supposed to implement and really make good on the laws and the policies that exist for social protection, but also underinvestment in the benefits, in the services that are needed. Now, expenditure on social protection, this is minus healthcare. For the world, on average, we have about 12.9% GDP, but this percentage is much lower, as we know, and you can guess. In low-income countries, it's as low as about 1%. And in upper middle-income countries, around 8%, lower middle-income countries, around 2.5%. But there is also an important point here, is that your income level does not dictate how much you spend. Countries at relatively similar levels of income still show diversity in terms of proportion that is spent on social protection, which really highlights the importance of political alliances, coalitions pushing for greater expenditure and investment in social protection, and what we call political will to do that. So important point there, income levels matter, but they're not destiny. Also very important, we know that from the calculations that we have done, that the financing gap has increased over the pandemic by about 30%. But the key point I want to highlight here is that globally, on average, an effort of about additional 3.8% of GDP is required in order to have a basic social protection floor. One that is composed of essential health and cash transfers for children, persons with disabilities, for maternity, and for old age. So not including all of the contingencies, but some of them. And here we need an extra effort on average about 3.8% of GDP. And this, as a percentage of GDP, becomes particularly significant when you look at the low-income countries, which need to invest an additional 15.9% of GDP, which really also highlights the point about the limitations of domestic resource mobilization for those categories of countries and the need for a greater, a more conducive international financial system, one that also complements their domestic efforts and does not undermine it. And I'll get to that in a little while. Now, these numbers are quite significant. They do indicate a huge effort that is needed for countries to be able to really close these financing gaps and make good on their promises to make social protection a right for their populations. But fiscal space is the kind of resources that countries can mobilize. In the human rights language, we talk about maximum available resources, how to maximize the fiscal space for social protection. And this is something that governments do have some control over. And I think the IMF is very active in terms of also helping countries mobilize the kind of fiscal space that is needed. And here, let me just say, two issues to highlight when it comes to social protection. As we know, in terms of broadly, two categories of financing that is needed are social security contributions and taxes. And it's not either or, it's both. Most countries use both. And I think it's important not to underestimate the significance and the value of social contributions, because there has been some not very useful discourse flying around within the international arena that kind of says, oh, social contributions, that's something of the past, it increases informality, it creates perverse incentives. And we did some quite, I think, interesting and forward-looking research with WeGo, and I'm hoping that our colleague from WeGo, who's going to join us in the panel, will say more about that, to show that social contributions are one of the main sources of financing for social protection, and they have remained significant throughout the 21st century. It's not something of the past. In 2019, social contributions, as you can see there, contributed around 18.8% of the total tax and contribution revenue that countries had, which was about 5.7% of GDP, not an insignificant amount. And this is an amount that is not decreasing. It's there, it's stable. Evidence, furthermore, does not show that there's a clear pattern between contribution rates and informality. It's not that if you reduce your contributions, somehow you will also tackle the problem of informality. Any reduction in social security contributions, we would argue, at the same time, has many adverse impacts because it means loss of that fiscal space. This is a kind of earmarked kind of financing for social protection. And therefore, reducing it, you lose that space, and then you have to make do by resorting to additional taxes that, as we know, is not easy to increase, and also some forms of taxation can be quite regressive, particularly if we rely heavily on consumption taxes. And so the lesson of this is take care of your social contributions, and particularly, as we'll see in the next figure, in regions where social contributions are not a significant share of the tax and contribution financing for social protection, there's room for increasing that financing. And here what we can see again is these are the figures that are available based on data from 81 countries. This is the paper that we commissioned together with WeGo, showing the same figure that I just told you globally, that social security contributions account for about 18.8% of total taxation and contribution, and about 5.7% of GDP. And what you can see is at the bottom of that figure are the figures for Asia Pacific, where social contributions are about 7.5% of total tax revenue. So there is space for extension, and there is a growing middle class in this region. There are many people in the informal economy who can contribute and who have the contributory capacity. So extending that social protection coverage to those groups can bring in the much needed additional revenue. But the story is not all well and good, because we have another major megatrend that I'm sure you have all been hearing about, which shows the amount of income that is allocated to labor compensation, whether in the form of wages or revenues for self-employment. And that amount is fairly stagnant. Profits are increasing, but labor income as a share of total income is stagnant. This is what is, I think, one of the challenges that many countries are facing. And here, globally, we know that across regions, the labor income share of GDP is stagnating. If you look at Asia and Pacific region, over the past 10 years, it has just moved from around 52% of GDP in 2010 to about 52.3% in 2020. And that's not atypical. Other regions is the same. We can talk about it in the discussion a bit more. And there are many reasons, possible reasons for this, including impact of technological changes associated with globalization, enhanced exercise of market power by large firms who don't respond to labor demands, decline in unionization rates, and the erosion of the bargaining power of workers in labor markets. So basically, the bargaining power of labor reducing has been, I think, quite significant in explaining these trends. And this is something we need to be worried about, because getting those social contributions will become difficult if labor income is stagnant and not growing and not keeping up with productivity increases. So that's something we do need to worry about. So moving from social contributions to taxes, now here, the IMF says that many countries have potential to increase their tax to GDP ratios by as much as 9 percentage points, many developing countries, middle-income countries in particular. So here, there's a lot of good policy advice that comes from institutions like the IMF about the need to build administrations that limit incentives and opportunities for rent-seeking, strengthen those tax authorities, they're important, need to invest in them. Combat tax evasion, avoid tax competition, and so forth. And I'm not going to go into the details, you have them there in the interest of time. But also what you will notice is what we call the great divergence. Corporate tax rates are declining, that's the red line, while top statutory personal income tax rates are increasing. And those what we call top statutory personal income. This is an average for 38 OECD countries, and these top statutory personal income tax rates really reflect the tax rates that many middle-class people are paying. This is not about top does not mean, the billionaire class. This means, your average middle-class families who are paying a lot into the tax system, and corporations are not doing so. Even over a period like from 2008 to 2022, there's a decline. And what is also important to say is that there's no consensus on the advantages of granting these kind of concessions to the big corporations, since the diversion of international investment or attraction of FDI flows often depends on many other factors, whether there's good infrastructure, whether there's good human capital, political stability, and so forth, and the quality of institutions. All of these matters much more than just the kind of tax concessions that are given. And here you can see that actually tax revenues from corporations have not really increased, even though tax rates have been reduced. So that, I think, sort of highlights the same point. There is space for greater cooperation on tax matters when it comes to multinational corporations, and I think there are important efforts on the way under the OECD as well to create those better conditions for having make them pay a fairer share of taxation as they should. Also, very importantly, alternative ways of increasing tax revenues. And here, these are some figures that come from a 2019 OECD paper that shows their estimates of increasing the price of carbon emissions to about 30 euros per ton of CO2 emission, which is a conservative estimate, would generate additional revenues of about, and you have the percentages, 5% of GDP in India and so forth. You can see the numbers. I won't dwell on them again in the interest of time. I'm looking at Wendy. It's okay, okay. Now, when it comes to financing, we talked about social contributions, their continued significance, and the space that countries have to actually do more in terms of expanding social contributions. We talked about different forms of taxation, in particular progressive taxes, wealth taxes being an important mechanism, as well as more progressive income taxes and also corporate taxes. But also something that is weighing very heavily at this particular moment on many developing countries is the amount of interest that they have to pay on their debts. And that interest rate has increased through no fault of countries that are paying the greatest payments relative to their income and are in debt distress. You know, it was not through any fault of their own that interest rates increased for, when we know, very complex reasons that have a lot to do with monetary policy in the high-income countries. But what you see here, and this is data from the Economic Commission for Latin America that produces the kind of data that I think is very useful in showing us the burden that this is having on the budgets of countries in that region. And I would think that maybe the same kind of general trend applies elsewhere. These estimates show the increasing burden that debt is having in terms of the fiscal expenditures that countries are making. And what we have here is the ratio of interest payments to expenditure on some of the items that you see, like education, health, social protection, and public investment. And what you see is that, for example, expenditure on social protection, the ratio of interest payments to expenditure on social protection increased from about 46% to 54% between 2012 and 2021. The same for health and education. Education from 47 to 63 and health from 62 to 64. And most importantly, those important public investments, fixed assets, increased from 76% paying in terms of interest compared to investments in public investment in fixed assets to about 185. So a huge amount of space being taken by these payments, interest rate payments, which, if they could be reduced, would free up that fiscal space for investments in things like education, health, and social protection. And of course, these, as we know, are subject to important negotiations, but to avoid the ongoing debt crisis with further widen this kind of social protection coverage and financing gaps in low and middle income countries, we do think in the UN and the ILO have launched a set of initiatives such as the Global Accelerator and the Global Fund for Social Protection and other initiatives to also chime in with the important negotiations that have to go on debt restructuring. And that takes me to my last, my penultimate slide, which is about this Global Accelerator on jobs and social protection that I'm sure you've been hearing about, and I hope during the panel we will have time to elaborate a bit more. I will remain rather brief here, but just to say that this was really an initiative that was launched by the UN Secretary General in September 2021, and it was really an effort to avoid the kind of great divergence between richer and poorer economies that continue to characterize labor market recovery after the COVID crisis. Even in 2022, this continued, as we know. So in September 2021, this initiative was launched. The initiative aims to increase the level of coordination of the multilateral systems efforts, and this means the UN itself working together as one, as UN reform demands, but also the UN system working also in coordination with and in tandem with the international financial institutions, the multilateral development banks, to really bring that needed financing and also technical support for creating integrated policies on social protection, on employment policies, industrial policies, to really create those kind of just transitions that we talk about, inclusive transitions that really take people with them and don't kind of leave them behind, by providing the kind of social protection coverage that is needed, unemployment protection for those who have to shift between sectors that are in decline and sectors that are dynamic and coming up. People don't just switch from one skill set to another. They need unemployment protection, they need cash benefits, they need skills and training, they need active labor market policies to be able to make those shifts. Now, this pillar 1 of this initiative addresses these policy dimensions that we've been talking about, those integrated policies, national employment, social protection, and just transition policies. And the second pillar is really about the challenges of resource mobilization that I think I spent a fair bit amount of time trying to talk about, the ways in which fiscal space can be expanded, even in the current contexts, and where international financing has an important role to play, whether it's through debt restructuring or through providing patient capital, the kind of capital that development banks provide for developmental investments in countries. And the third pillar is really about that enhanced multilateral cooperation. So we don't have the UN system kind of working on its own and somehow disjointed from what the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks are doing. So this is kind of, in a nutshell, what is being tried. And I think what I also want to emphasize here is that this effort at coordination under the accelerator is one kind of part of the initiative, but there's a lot more that is happening, and you know about some of those. The SPIAC-B, which is a coordination mechanism for a lot of the bilateral, multilateral agencies that are working on social protection. We also have efforts underway in USP 2030 to really bring kind of greater coherence and collaboration among those working on social protection issues, including very important work that USP 2030 has been doing in terms of giving guidance on financing of social protection, kind of very clear guiding principles that countries can follow. I also want to just highlight that in the ILO, we also have had a very interesting pilot initiative in only 4 countries, but now we're expanding it to 8, working very closely with the IMF on how to create fiscal space for social protection. And I think there's some interesting lessons coming from that I hope that we can have maybe some time to reflect on. And so let me just end by one piece of good news to say that we are doing our new estimates on financing gap for social protection. We already had 2 editions of the financing gap estimates, and now in 2024 we're going to come up in the first quarter of the year with the new estimates, which are not only global and regional averages but also include national averages. And I know this is national data, something that countries really need in order to be able to have that fine-grained discussions and work on how to create fiscal space, on doing the costing, and think about the financing. So we hope that this will be a useful resource for all of us working on social protection. So let me really thank you for your patience in listening in this morning, and I thank you for your attention.